There are some nights a person remembers for the rest of his life. Not because anything beautiful happened, but because, on that night, the world they knew suddenly became dangerous. Imagine a small home in the Rhodesian countryside. The sun has gone down. The fields are dark. Inside the house, a family is settling in for the night. A mother is putting the younger children to sleep. Someone has finished eating. An older child is still awake. Outside, the night sounds ordinary. Crickets. The wind moving through the grass. Perhaps cattle shifting somewhere in the darkness. Then comes a sound. Footsteps. The family becomes quiet. Another sound follows. Voices. Men are approaching. Nobody inside the house knows exactly who they are. In a war like this, that question could mean the difference between life and death. Are they guerrillas? Are they government soldiers? Are they simply passing through? Or have they come looking for someone? The father looks toward the door. The children are told to stay quiet. Nobody knows what will happen when that door opens. And this was the terrible reality of the Rhodesian Bush War. For many ordinary people, the war did not arrive as a headline in a newspaper. It arrived at night. It came along a dusty road. It appeared at the edge of a field. It knocked on the door of a family that had never declared war on anyone. And sometimes, the people caught in the middle had no safe answer. If guerrillas asked for food, refusing them could be dangerous. If they were given food, government forces might later accuse the family of helping the enemy. If soldiers came looking for information, silence could look like guilt. In a war fought partly through villages and farms, ordinary people could find themselves surrounded by choices that were not really choices at all. But this raises a question. How did a country reach this point? How did a land in southern Africa become known as Rhodesia? How did a small white population come to control so much political power over a much larger African population? Why did Britain eventually find itself opposing the government of its own former colony? Why did African nationalists take up guns? And how did all of this eventually produce a country called Zimbabwe? To understand that night, we have to go back. Not to 1965. Not even to the beginning of the war. We have to go back to a time before there was a Rhodesia at all. A time when the land had other names. When African communities had their own leaders, farms, cattle, markets, and traditions. A time before the arrival of men who looked at this land and saw something very different. They saw opportunity. They saw wealth. They saw territory. And they believed they could make it theirs. That was where the story of Rhodesia began. And eventually, it would lead to one of the longest and most bitter wars of liberation in southern Africa. A war that would cost thousands of lives. A war that would divide families and communities. A war that would end one political system and give birth to a new country. Zimbabwe. But before Zimbabwe, there was Rhodesia. And before Rhodesia, there was Africa. Chapter 1. Before Rhodesia. Long before anyone called this land Rhodesia, people were already living here. They planted crops. They kept cattle. They traded. They raised children. They buried their dead. And they passed stories from one generation to the next. There was no empty land waiting for someone to give it a name. There were communities spread across the hills, valleys, and open grasslands of southern Africa. Among them were people we now broadly describe as Shona-speaking communities. There were also the Ndebele, whose kingdom became a powerful force in the region during the 19th century. These societies were not all the same. They had different leaders, different customs, different rivalries, different ways of organizing their communities. But they shared something important. This was home. For a farmer, home might have been a small field where maize or millet grew when the rains came. For a cattle keeper, it might have been the open grassland where his animals grazed. For a child, it was the place where his mother called him in before darkness settled over the village. Life could be difficult. Drought could destroy crops. Disease could kill livestock. Conflicts could break out between communities. Power could change hands. But these were societies with their own problems, their own solutions and their own history. They were not waiting for European history to begin. They already had one. And then, during the 19th century, the world around them began to change. Far to the south, European settlers had established themselves in the region that would become South Africa. Across Africa, European powers were competing for territory. Britain wanted to expand its influence. Portugal was protecting its interest. Germany was becoming an imperial power. France was expanding across large parts of West and Central Africa. European governments, businessmen and adventurers were looking northward. And one British man had ambitions that were much larger than an ordinary business venture. His name was Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes believed Britain should control a vast stretch of territory running northward through southern Africa. He was wealthy. He was ambitious. And he believed the British Empire should become even larger. But there was another thing driving men like him. Gold. Stories of mineral wealth were spreading across southern Africa. Gold had already transformed places further south. And rumors suggested that more wealth might be waiting further north. To European businessmen, the possibility was irresistible. To African communities already living on the land, something very different was approaching. Men with strange clothes. Strange weapons. Strange ideas about ownership. And behind them stood something even more powerful. The British Empire. But Rhodes could not simply walk into African territory and announce that it now belonged to him. He needed authority. He needed political backing. And he needed a way to turn ambition into control. So he created a company that would become one of the most important organizations in the history of this land. The British South Africa Company. In 1889, the British government granted the company a royal charter. That charter gave the company extraordinary powers. It could make agreements. It could administer territory. It could organize armed forces. It could search for minerals. And it could expand British influence. It was a company. But it possessed powers that went far beyond those of an ordinary business. Rhodes now had the instrument he needed. In 1890, a group of settlers known as the Pioneer Column moved north into Mashonaland. They were not simply tourists. They were there to establish a permanent European presence. They traveled with wagons, supplies, weapons and equipment. And when they stopped, they began building. One of the places they established became known as Fort Salisbury. That settlement would eventually grow into the city we now know as Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. But the arrival of Europeans did not mean that Africans simply disappeared. They were still there. They watched the newcomers arrive. They watched strange buildings appear. They watched new authorities begin to make claims over land. And they had to decide how to respond. Some resisted. Some negotiated. Some tried to understand what these newcomers wanted. Others hoped they could use the new arrivals to strengthen their own position against rivals. But the Europeans had ambitions that went far beyond simply trading with local communities. They wanted control. And when African resistance became strong enough, the newcomers were prepared to use force. The Ndebele Kingdom, one of the most powerful political forces in the region, became a major obstacle to European expansion. Conflict followed. The First Matabele War broke out in the 1890s. European forces eventually defeated Ndebele resistance. And as the colonial system expanded, resistance continued elsewhere. The message was becoming clear. This was no longer simply a meeting between Africans and foreign visitors. A new political order was being built. And Europeans were placing themselves at its center. The land was beginning to change. European settlers arrived. Farms were established. Mines were developed. Roads and settlements appeared. And the company that had entered as a commercial organization increasingly looked like a government. But something else was changing too. The newcomers were not only interested in controlling territory. They wanted to live there. They wanted farms. They wanted businesses. They wanted houses. They wanted political influence. They wanted a future for their children. And that meant that the relationship between the newcomers and the people already living there was about to become much more difficult. Because when a stranger visits your home, you can welcome him. You can trade with him. You can send him away. But what happens when he decides he is staying? And what happens when he begins telling you that part of your home now belongs to him? That was the question Southern Rhodesia would spend decades struggling to answer. And the answer would be written not only in laws, but in land. In the next chapter, we will see what happened when the new settlers began turning African land into a foundation for their own society. Chapter 2: When the land changed hands. A piece of land can look very different depending on who is standing on it. To a government official, it can be a line on a map. To a businessman, it can be a farm. To a company searching for wealth, it can be a place where money is waiting underground. But to a family that has lived there for generations, land is something much deeper. It is where you grow your food, where your cattle feed, where your children learn to walk, where your parents are buried. It is home. And as European settlement expanded across Southern Rhodesia, the meaning of land became one of the most important questions in the country's history. The British South Africa Company had entered the territory promising wealth and expansion. But the gold discoveries that settlers hoped for did not turn Southern Rhodesia into another great gold kingdom. So the settlers looked elsewhere. They looked to the soil. They looked to farming. And they began building a society around European ownership of land. At first, the system was still taking shape. But the direction was becoming clear. European settlers were given access to large areas of land. African communities found their freedom to use land increasingly restricted. The newcomers were not simply adding themselves to an existing society. They were creating a new one. And that new society needed workers. European farms needed labor. Mines needed labor. Cities needed labor. Roads and railways needed labor. Taxes also pushed Africans into the cash economy. If a family had to pay a tax in money, growing food for the family alone was no longer enough. A man might have to leave his village and travel to a mine or farm to earn wages. He could spend months away from his wife and children, then return home exhausted. This changed everyday life. A person could still live in an African village. But the colonial economy was reaching into that village. It was reaching into the household. It was reaching into the fields. And it was reaching into the future of the children growing up there. Over time, the colonial authorities introduced laws that made the division of land even more formal. The most important came in 1930. It was called the Land Apportionment Act. In simple terms, the law divided land according to race. Large areas were designated for European occupation, while Africans were restricted to areas set aside for them. The system did not simply separate people. It separated opportunity. The best agricultural land was increasingly concentrated in European hands. African communities were pushed into areas that were often more crowded and less suitable for large-scale farming. Imagine a farmer who has spent years caring for his soil. His father farmed there. His grandfather farmed there. Then someone tells him that the law has changed. The land is no longer available to him in the same way. He has not moved. His home has not moved. But the meaning of the ground beneath his feet has changed. It now belongs to a system he did not create. This is one reason we must be careful when we talk about colonialism. It was not only about a foreign flag flying over a government building. It was about ordinary things. Where you could live. Where you could farm. Where you could work. Where your children could grow up. And who could become wealthy from the land. Meanwhile, the European settler population was growing. Settlers built farms, businesses, and towns. They created schools. They established churches. They built roads and railways. Cities expanded. The economy became more organized. Southern Rhodesia was developing rapidly, But development was not shared equally. A white settler could look at the country and see opportunity. An African farmer could look at the same country and see restrictions closing around him. Both were living in the same territory, but they were experiencing very different versions of it. And this difference would become more important with every passing year. Because the settlers were not only building farms. They were building a political community. They wanted greater control over their own affairs. They wanted to decide how the colony should be governed. And Britain eventually allowed them a remarkable degree of self-government. In 1923, Southern Rhodesia became a self-governing British colony. This was a major turning point. The white settlers now had considerable control over the government. But there was a problem that would never disappear. The African population was vastly larger. Yet political power remained concentrated in the hands of the white minority. The contradiction was becoming harder to ignore. A modern political system was growing. Schools were opening. Cities were expanding. Businesses were making money. Railways were connecting different parts of the country. But the people who formed the overwhelming majority of the population did not have equal political power. And the question of land was still sitting underneath everything. Because land had created wealth. Land had created political influence. And land had helped create the society that the settlers now wanted to protect. For many white Rhodesians, this was the country they had built with their own hands. They had farms here. Homes here. Businesses here. Their children had been born here. Some had never even seen Britain. They did not think of themselves as temporary visitors. They thought of Rhodesia as home. For Africans, however, another memory remained. This land had been home before Rhodesia existed. And the new political system had not given the African majority equal control over the country in which they lived. That tension would grow quietly for decades. Then it would become political. And eventually, it would become explosive. Because a country can survive inequality for a long time. But it becomes much harder when the people living under that inequality begin asking a simple question. Why should we have so little say in the country where we are the majority? That question would produce a new generation of African political leaders. And they would no longer be willing to wait patiently for change. The struggle for Rhodesia's future was about to move from the field into politics. Chapter 3. A minority builds a country. By the middle of the 20th century, Southern Rhodesia was changing quickly. Railway lines stretched across the countryside. Towns were growing. Factories were opening. Mines were producing valuable minerals. European farmers were producing tobacco, maize and other crops on large commercial farms. In places like Salisbury and Bulawayo, modern buildings stood beside busy streets filled with cars, buses and workers. To many white Rhodesians, this was proof that they were building a successful country. And in one sense, they were. But there was another side to the picture. The country was being built on a political system in which race mattered. A person's skin color could affect where he lived, what land he could own, what schools his children attended, what jobs were open to him, and how much political power he could exercise. The contradiction was becoming impossible to hide. Southern Rhodesia was developing. But it was not developing as an equal society. And the people who carried the greatest political weight were a small minority. The white population was only a fraction of the African population. Yet white Rhodesians controlled most of the country's political institutions and much of its economic power. For many years, this system seemed stable. But stability is not the same thing as justice. And beneath the surface, something was changing. African workers were traveling to the growing towns. More Africans were receiving formal education. Teachers, journalists, trade unionists, and other educated Africans began discussing questions that earlier generations had struggled to organize around. Why should Africans have so little control over their own government? Why should political rights depend so heavily on race? Why should a person born in Rhodesia have fewer opportunities because he was black? These questions did not appear in one day. They grew slowly. A conversation here. A meeting there. a newspaper article, a workers' protest, a political organization, then another. African political consciousness was spreading. And the government noticed. The authorities often responded with restrictions, arrests and laws designed to control political activity. But repression could not make the questions disappear. In fact, it often made them stronger. A young African watching his parents struggle might begin to wonder why the country had so much wealth but so little equality. A worker returning from the city might bring home stories about political meetings. A student might read about other countries fighting colonial rule. And across Africa, something extraordinary was happening. One country after another was becoming independent. Ghana became independent in 1957. Nigeria followed in 1960. Tanzania became independent in 1961. Uganda followed in 1962. Across the continent, the old colonial order was beginning to collapse. African flags were replacing European ones. African leaders were taking seats in governments that had once been controlled by Europeans. And Africans in Southern Rhodesia were watching. They began asking, why not us? That question frightened many white Rhodesians. They could see what was happening elsewhere. They knew that majority rule was spreading across Africa. And they feared that if it came to Southern Rhodesia, their political influence, their land and the society they had built could change dramatically. So the political divide became sharper. African nationalists demanded greater political rights and eventually majority rule. White politicians increasingly argued that rapid majority rule would destroy the country. Both sides believed they were fighting for the future. But they imagined very different futures. For African nationalists, the future meant political equality. For many white Rhodesians, the future meant preserving the system they believed had made Rhodesia prosperous and stable. And Britain was now caught between them. Britain still had ultimate responsibility for the colony. But Southern Rhodesia had enjoyed self-government for decades. The white government expected Britain to respect that tradition. African nationalists expected Britain to help end minority rule. The pressure was building. Then, in the early 1960s, the political struggle entered a dangerous new stage. African nationalist organizations became more organized. Some leaders were imprisoned. Political parties were banned or restricted. The possibility of peaceful constitutional change began to look increasingly uncertain. Two major nationalist movements would eventually dominate the struggle. ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union. And later, ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union. Their histories were different. Their leaders were different. Their political relationships were different. But they shared a central demand. African majority rule. The government in Salisbury was not prepared to surrender power simply because the majority demanded it. And Britain was not prepared to grant the white government the kind of independence it wanted without a path toward majority rule. That disagreement would soon produce a political crisis. But before that crisis exploded, another man was rising inside white Rhodesian politics. He was not a British governor. He was not a man sent from London to rule the colony. He was a Rhodesian politician. A man born in Southern Rhodesia. A man who believed that his country should be independent. But he did not believe that independence should mean handing political power immediately to the African majority. His name was Ian Smith. And soon, he would make a decision that would change the history of Rhodesia forever. Britain was about to tell him that independence had a condition. And Smith was about to decide whether he was willing to accept it. Chapter 4. The Men Who Demanded a Voice. By the early 1960s, the argument over Rhodesia was no longer a quiet disagreement. It had become a struggle over the country's future. Across Africa, colonial governments were disappearing. But in Southern Rhodesia, white minority rule remained firmly in place. For many Africans, patience was running out. They had watched other African countries gain independence. They had heard African leaders speak about freedom. They had seen new flags rise over capitals that had once been controlled by European governments. And they were asking a question that became harder to silence. Why should Rhodesia be different? Among the people asking that question were men who would become some of the most important political figures in Zimbabwe's history. One of them was Joshua Nkomo. Nkomo came from the African working class and rose to become a powerful nationalist leader. He became one of the central figures in the struggle against white minority rule. His political movement eventually became known as the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU. Nkomo believed Africans had to gain control of their own political future. But the government saw the nationalist movement as a threat. Political organizations were restricted. Leaders were arrested. Meetings were broken up. And some nationalist organizations were eventually banned. The government hoped that by removing political leaders from the streets, it could weaken the movement. Instead, the struggle changed shape. Another nationalist organization emerged. The Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU. Its formation deepened the political divisions within African nationalism. ZANU and ZAPU were both fighting against minority rule, but they were not the same movement. They had different leaderships, different political histories, and eventually, different military organizations. ZANU would become associated with the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, known as ZANLA. ZAPU would become associated with the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, known as ZIPRA. But at this point, the guns were not yet the main story. The struggle was still political. People held meetings. They organized communities. They distributed political messages. They demanded greater representation. They challenged the government. And the government responded with increasing restrictions. For an ordinary African, politics could now carry a personal price. A man could attend a meeting and find himself watched. A teacher could speak too openly and attract unwanted attention. A young activist could discover that political activity could lead to arrest. The government was trying to contain a movement that was becoming too large to ignore. But there was another problem. The white population was also becoming more politically determined. Many white Rhodesians feared what majority rule would mean for their families, their farms, and their future. They looked north and saw countries where colonial rule had ended. Some feared that Rhodesia would soon follow. Others believed that if Britain forced majority rule too quickly, the country would descend into disorder. Their fear strengthened the white political movement that would soon bring Ian Smith to the center of the crisis. The two sides were now moving in opposite directions. African nationalists were demanding one person, one vote. White politicians were demanding protection for the existing political system. And Britain stood between them. London understood that the old colonial order could not continue forever. But Britain also knew that Southern Rhodesia was not governed in exactly the same way as many other British colonies. White settlers had enjoyed responsible government since 1923. They had their own parliament, their own political parties, their own government. And they expected Britain to respect that tradition. The question was becoming increasingly difficult. Could Britain grant independence to a government that did not represent the African majority on equal terms? For African nationalists, the answer was clear. No. They believed independence without majority rule would simply turn colonialism into something new. The flag might change. The name might change. But the people holding political power would remain largely the same. That was not the freedom they were demanding. For many white Rhodesians, however, the argument looked completely different. They believed they had built the country. They had been born there. Their families had lived there for generations. They did not think of themselves as temporary colonial officials waiting for Britain to send them home. They thought of themselves as Rhodesians. And they wanted their own country. This was the dangerous contradiction at the heart of the coming crisis. The African majority wanted independence from minority rule. The white minority wanted independence from Britain. Both were using the language of freedom. But they were talking about very different things. And standing in the middle was Britain. Britain's answer would soon become clear. Southern Rhodesia could become independent. But there had to be a path toward majority rule. The white political leadership did not accept that condition. And within that leadership, one man was becoming increasingly important. His name was Ian Smith. He had served as Deputy Prime Minister. He was a leading figure in the Rhodesian Front, the white political party that opposed rapid transition to majority rule. In 1964, Smith became Prime Minister. He inherited a country already divided by race, land, and political power. But he also inherited a question that could no longer be postponed. Britain wanted him to accept a future in which political power would eventually belong to the African majority. Smith wanted independence without accepting that demand. For months, negotiations continued. The two sides argued over constitutions, voting rights, and the future of the country. But behind the formal language of politics was a much bigger question. Who would control Rhodesia after independence? The answer was becoming impossible to negotiate. And while politicians argued in offices and conference rooms, ordinary people waited. Some hoped the country would change peacefully. Some feared what was coming. And some were already preparing for something much more dangerous. Because when political leaders reach a point where neither side is willing to give way, there are only a few paths left. One is compromise. Another is confrontation. And the road Rhodesia was taking was leading toward confrontation. On November 11, 1965, Ian Smith and his government would make their choice. They would declare that Rhodesia was no longer under British rule. Britain would say the declaration was illegal. African nationalists would reject it. And the political crisis would enter a new and far more dangerous phase. Rhodesia was about to declare independence. But independence for whom? Chapter 5. Ian Smith says no. On the morning of November 11, 1965, Rhodesia was still officially a British colony. By the end of that day, Ian Smith's government would claim that it was no longer one. The announcement had been building for months. Britain and Rhodesia had been arguing over the same question. Could Rhodesia become independent while white politicians still controlled the government? Britain's answer was no. Ian Smith's answer was increasingly clear. He believed Rhodesia should decide its own future. But he did not accept that independence should immediately lead to majority rule. To Smith and his supporters, this was about protecting the political system they believed had kept Rhodesia stable. To African nationalists, it was something very different. They saw it as an attempt by a minority to make its control permanent. And Britain was refusing to recognize that kind of independence. The negotiations went nowhere. Smith returned home without the agreement he wanted. Then, on that November morning, he appeared before the people of Rhodesia. His government announced what became known as the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, or UDI. The word unilateral simply meant that Rhodesia was making the decision by itself. Britain had not agreed. So Smith's government declared independence anyway. For white Rhodesians who supported him, it was a moment of defiance. They believed Britain was abandoning them. They believed they had the right to determine their own future. But for African nationalists, the declaration meant something else. They saw it as a direct attempt to prevent the African majority from taking political power. The crisis had now become much bigger than an argument between Ian Smith and the British government. It was about the future of millions of people. Britain immediately rejected the declaration. The British government made it clear that Smith's government had no legal authority to declare independence in this way. Britain also took economic measures against Rhodesia. Other countries followed with sanctions. The United Nations condemned the declaration and called on countries not to recognize the illegal government. Rhodesia found itself increasingly isolated. But Ian Smith did not back down. He believed that the country could survive without Britain's approval. For the moment, the white government remained in control. The police still answered to it. The security forces still answered to it. The civil service continued working. The farms continued producing. The shops remained open. Life in Rhodesia did not suddenly stop. That was part of what made the crisis so dangerous. A country could appear normal on the surface while its political foundations were becoming more unstable underneath. And for African nationalists, UDI confirmed something they had feared. Peaceful political change seemed further away than ever. If the government would not surrender power through negotiations, what other choices remained? Some nationalist leaders had already concluded that armed struggle was necessary. Now the political environment became even more hostile. The government increased its efforts to suppress nationalist activity. Leaders were detained. Political organizations were restricted. And people who supported the nationalist cause faced increasing pressure. Across the border, neighboring African countries were becoming important to the struggle. Zambia provided space for nationalist activity. Later, Mozambique would become especially important to the war. Training camps began producing men who were no longer preparing to attend political meetings. They were preparing to fight. The first armed clashes had already occurred before UDI. But the declaration changed the meaning of the conflict. The political door was becoming narrower. The military door was opening wider. And two armed movements would eventually become the main forces fighting the Rhodesian government. ZANLA, the armed wing of ZANU, and ZAPU, the armed wing of ZAPU. Their fighters would cross borders, move through rural communities and attack government targets. The Rhodesian government would respond with soldiers, police and increasingly sophisticated counterinsurgency operations. But that larger war had not yet reached its full scale. For the moment, Ian Smith had achieved what he wanted. Rhodesia had declared itself independent. But there was a problem. Almost nobody outside the country accepted that independence as legitimate. Britain refused. The United Nations refused. African nationalist movements refused. And the African majority had not been given the political power they had demanded. So Smith had won the declaration. But he had not solved the question that had produced the crisis in the first place. Who would rule Rhodesia? That question was still waiting. And now, more and more people were beginning to believe that it would not be answered in Parliament. It would be answered in the countryside. With rifles. With ambushes. With fear. And with young men willing to cross borders to learn how to fight. The war that had been approaching for years was about to become real. Politics had failed to settle the question. Now the guns would speak. Chapter 6. When politics became war. The first men who crossed into Rhodesia carrying guns did not look like an army. They did not arrive in tanks. They did not march behind flags. They moved quietly. Sometimes at night. Sometimes through bush paths that only local people knew. They carried rifles, ammunition and supplies on their backs. And many of them were young. They were entering a country where the government had spent years trying to control political opposition. Now they had decided to challenge that government by force. This was the beginning of a different kind of struggle. A guerrilla war. A guerrilla is a fighter who usually avoids fighting a stronger army in a large, open battle. Instead, guerrillas attack suddenly. They strike a target. Then disappear into the countryside. The idea is simple. Do not allow the stronger army to use all its strength against you. Make the war difficult. Make it expensive. Make it last. The African nationalist movements had been divided by politics. Now their armed wings would become increasingly important. On one side was ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union. Its military wing became known as ZANLA, the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army. On the other side was ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union. Its military wing was ZAPU, the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army. They were fighting the same broad enemy. But they were not the same organization. They had different leaders, different political histories and different foreign supporters. ZANLA developed strong connections with China. ZAPU received important support from the Soviet Union. Training camps appeared outside Rhodesia. Young men left their homes and traveled across borders. Some had never fired a gun before. Now they were learning how to handle rifles, move through difficult terrain, gather information and survive without the comforts of home. For some, the decision was political. They believed their country could not become free through peaceful protest. For others, the decision was deeply personal. Perhaps a relative had been arrested. Perhaps they had seen political violence. Perhaps they had grown up watching people around them live without meaningful political power. And for some young men, joining the struggle may have seemed like the only way to change the future. But becoming a guerrilla meant leaving something behind. A mother. A father. A wife. A child. A farm. A school. A familiar road. The young man who left home with a rifle might not return for years. And some would never return. Inside Rhodesia, the government was also preparing. The security forces included the Rhodesian Army, the British South Africa Police, the Rhodesian Air Force, and other security and auxiliary forces. Their job was to defend the state. At first, the government faced relatively small numbers of guerrillas. But guerrilla warfare is not measured only by the number of fighters carrying guns. It depends heavily on the population around them. A guerrilla needs food. He needs information. He needs shelter. He needs people who know the roads and paths. He needs somewhere to hide. And that brought the war directly into the lives of ordinary people. A village could suddenly become important simply because it was close to a road. A farmer could become important because he had seen strangers passing through. A schoolteacher could be questioned because someone believed he knew where guerrillas were hiding. A young man could be suspected simply because he had disappeared from home. The countryside was becoming a place where trust was difficult. People had to be careful about what they said. And sometimes, even silence could be dangerous. The Rhodesian government began increasing its counterinsurgency operations. Soldiers and police moved through rural areas looking for guerrillas. They gathered intelligence. They searched homes. They questioned villagers. They established ways of monitoring rural communities. The government understood an important fact. If it could separate the guerrillas from the people around them, it could weaken the insurgency. The guerrillas understood the same thing from the opposite direction. If they could build relationships with rural communities, they could survive. So the struggle for the countryside became central to the war. And this created a terrible problem. The ordinary African villager could find himself caught between two armed forces. One side might arrive at night. The other might arrive the next morning. Both might ask questions. Both might want information. And both might punish people they believed were helping the other side. This is what made the war so frightening. There was often no clear battlefield. The battlefield could be a village, a farm, a road, a field, a family home. The war was slowly moving into places where people had once believed they were safe. And there was another reason the conflict was becoming harder to stop. Rhodesia was surrounded by countries that were increasingly hostile to white minority rule. To the north was Zambia. To the east, Mozambique was still under Portuguese colonial rule. But Mozambique was changing. In 1975, it would become independent under Frelimo, a movement that supported the struggle against Rhodesia. That would transform the war. A long border would suddenly separate Rhodesia from a neighboring country where its enemies could operate more freely. The geography of the conflict was changing. The guerrillas had more room. The Rhodesian government had more territory to defend. And the war was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. For the young fighters, this was no longer simply a political campaign. It was a war. For the soldiers and police on the other side, it was also becoming a war. But for the civilians living between them, there was another name for it. Survival. Because when armed men enter your village, ideology becomes very simple. You want your children to be safe. You want your home to remain standing. You want to wake up the next morning. And as the fighting spread, more and more ordinary Zimbabweans would discover that staying out of the war was becoming almost impossible. The government needed them. The guerrillas needed them. And both sides suspected them. The countryside was becoming the place where the future of Rhodesia would be decided. Not in the offices of Salisbury. Not in London. But among people who had never expected to become part of a war. And that is where the story becomes most painful. Because once the fighters begin depending on the civilian population, The people who never chose the war can become its most important targets. Chapter 7. Between Two Fires. For a family living in the Rhodesian countryside, the war did not always announce itself with gunfire. Sometimes, it arrived quietly. A stranger appeared on the road. A young man came to the door after dark. Someone asked for food. Someone else wanted information. And the family had to decide what to say. This was the difficult reality of guerrilla warfare. The countryside was no longer simply where people lived and worked. It had become part of the battlefield. A guerrilla fighter could move through an area because he knew the paths, the rivers, and the villages. He could depend on local people for food or information. But that same dependence created danger. If government soldiers believed the village was helping guerrillas, they could treat the villagers as suspects. If guerrillas believed someone was cooperating with the government, that person could also become a target. For ordinary people, there was often no safe side. Imagine a farmer returning home after a long day in the field. He sees men approaching. They are carrying rifles. He recognizes some of them as young men from the area. They ask for food. What should he do? If he refuses, they may become angry. If he gives them food, what happens if government forces arrive tomorrow and discover what happened? There is no easy answer. And this was the kind of fear that slowly entered everyday life. People became careful about what they said. Careful about who they trusted. Careful about what they told their neighbors. A simple conversation could later be interpreted as evidence of political loyalty. A person could be accused of helping the enemy without ever carrying a weapon. The war also changed the movement of people. The Rhodesian government introduced measures designed to control rural populations and make it harder for guerrillas to operate among them. One of these measures involved the creation and expansion of protected villages. Families were moved into more controlled settlements where government forces could monitor movement and provide security. The reasoning was military. If guerrillas could no longer easily reach scattered rural families, they would have more difficulty obtaining food, information, and support. But for the people being moved, the experience could be deeply disruptive. Imagine leaving the land where your family had lived for years. Leaving your fields. Leaving your cattle. Leaving the familiar path to a river. Leaving the graves of relatives. And being told that you must now live somewhere else because a war is being fought around you. For some people, these settlements offered protection. For others, they felt like another form of control. There was no single experience. And that is important. The war did not affect every village in exactly the same way. Some communities were more heavily involved. Some experienced fighting directly. Others lived for long periods with fear and uncertainty rather than constant violence. But the pressure was spreading. And women carried much of it. A woman might have to keep a household running while her husband was away. She might have children to feed while crops had been damaged or abandoned. She might have a son who had joined the guerrillas. Or a husband serving with the government forces. She could lose someone without ever understanding exactly what had happened. And sometimes women themselves became involved in the political struggle. Some supported nationalist movements. Some carried messages or supplies. Some joined the armed struggle. Others wanted nothing to do with it. There were no simple categories. The same was true of young people. For some young Africans, the nationalist struggle represented hope. They had grown up hearing that their parents had little political power. They had watched other African countries become independent. They believed their generation could change Rhodesia. But joining the struggle meant entering a world where death was always nearby. A young person could leave home believing he was going to fight for freedom. He might return years later carrying memories that would never leave him. Or he might not return at all. On the other side were young men serving in the Rhodesian security forces. Some were professional soldiers. Others were conscripts. Some were deeply committed to defending Rhodesia. Others were simply doing their military service. They, too, could be sent into the countryside and told that someone nearby might be an enemy. They could be ambushed. They could lose friends. They could become suspicious of the people they were supposed to protect. And this is where the war became particularly tragic. Two young men could be standing on opposite sides of the same conflict. One believed he was fighting for freedom. The other believed he was defending his home. Both could be frightened. Both could believe they were doing the right thing. And both could die far from the political leaders who had shaped the conflict. As the war intensified, civilians increasingly became caught in acts of violence committed by both sides. Guerrillas attacked government personnel, infrastructure, and people they believed were collaborating with the state. Chapter 8. The war becomes international. By the middle of the 1970s, the Rhodesian Bush War had changed. It was no longer a conflict that Rhodesia could treat as a problem inside its own borders. The map around it was changing. To the north was Zambia, which had become independent in 1964. To the east was Mozambique. For years, Mozambique had been ruled by Portugal. Then, in 1974, a revolution in Portugal brought an end to its dictatorship and accelerated the collapse of Portuguese colonial rule. On June 25, 1975, Mozambique became independent. Its new government was led by Frelimo, a movement that supported African liberation struggles in the region. Suddenly, Rhodesia had a long border with a country that was prepared to allow Zimbabwean nationalist fighters to operate from its territory. This changed the war dramatically. Before this, guerrillas had already used neighboring countries for training, organization, and movement. Now the eastern border became even more important. Men could cross into Mozambique. They could train there. They could receive weapons. And they could return to Rhodesia. For the Rhodesian government, this was a serious problem. It meant the enemy was no longer limited to hidden groups operating inside the country. The war now had a network stretching across national borders. And behind this movement stood another powerful force: the Cold War. To understand this, we have to leave Africa for a moment. After the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's two great rival powers. They represented competing political systems. The United States generally supported capitalism and Western-aligned governments. The Soviet Union supported communist governments and revolutionary movements in many parts of the world. They rarely fought each other directly. Instead, they supported different sides in conflicts around the world. Africa became one of those places. The liberation struggles of Southern Africa were therefore not only about colonialism and majority rule. They also became connected to the wider struggle between East and West. ZANU developed strong ties with China and received Chinese assistance, including military training. ZAPU developed close relations with the Soviet Union and received Soviet support. The difference mattered. The two movements were fighting against the same Rhodesian government. But they were building different military organizations with different international relationships. ZANLA fighters were trained in countries including Tanzania and later Mozambique. ZIPRO fighters received training and support from the Soviet Union and its allies. The war was becoming more organized. The fighters were no longer simply a few young men crossing borders with rifles. The nationalist armies were growing. Their networks were expanding. Their ability to operate inside Rhodesia was increasing. And the Rhodesian government responded. It had highly trained soldiers. It had experienced police units. It had an air force. It developed specialized counterinsurgency forces designed to find and attack guerrilla groups. Rhodesian forces also began conducting operations beyond the country's borders. The government argued that these attacks were necessary because guerrilla bases and training camps existed outside Rhodesia. But cross-border military operations also meant that neighboring countries were being pulled further into the conflict. The war was spreading. And every new border crossing created another possibility for escalation. For ordinary people living near those borders, international politics was not an abstract idea. It could mean aircraft overhead. It could mean soldiers moving through villages. It could mean people suddenly leaving their homes. It could mean a young man disappearing across the border to join a training camp. A political decision made in Lusaka, Maputo, Beijing, Moscow, or Salisbury could eventually be felt by a family sitting around a small fire in the countryside. That is how international politics enters a village. Not as a speech, but as a rifle, or a truck, or an empty chair at the dinner table. And the war continued to grow. The nationalist movements were gaining strength. The Rhodesian government was increasing military pressure. But there was another development that was perhaps even more important. The white minority was becoming increasingly aware that time was not on its side. The war was costing money. Young men were being called up for military service. Families were becoming tired of the uncertainty. The country's international isolation remained. And neighboring Mozambique was now openly supporting the nationalist struggle. Rhodesia was fighting harder. But the conflict was also becoming harder to win. Meanwhile, the nationalist movements were making greater efforts to mobilize rural Africans. ZANU in particular expanded its presence in the countryside. Its fighters moved through rural areas, organized political support and attacked government targets. The government's response became increasingly aggressive. The conflict began to resemble a struggle for control of the countryside itself. Who could move freely? Who could gather information? Who could influence the villagers? Who could convince people that their side represented the future? That became the real contest. And by the late 1970s, the answer was becoming increasingly clear. Rhodesia could still have the guerrillas. It could still launch devastating military operations. It could still defend important towns and strategic areas. But it could not easily destroy the nationalist movements. The war had become too deeply rooted. Too many people were involved. Too many neighboring countries were connected to it. And too many international powers had interest in its outcome. There was also a growing political reality that military victories could not erase. The African majority was demanding political power. The longer the war continued, the harder it became to imagine a future in which that demand could simply be ignored. Rhodesia was becoming trapped. It could fight. It could negotiate. Or it could try to do both. But sooner or later, the country would have to answer the question it had avoided for years. Could minority rule survive forever in a country where the majority wanted political power? By the end of the 1970s, the answer was becoming harder to believe. The war had spread beyond the borders. The nationalist armies had grown. The Rhodesian economy was under pressure. And ordinary people had been living with violence for years. Everyone was beginning to feel the weight of exhaustion. The question was no longer simply, who can win? It was becoming, how can this war end? And that question would soon bring the battlefield and the negotiating table together. Chapter 9. The war that would not end. By the late 1970s, the war had entered a different stage. It was no longer a conflict that Rhodesia could hope to contain quickly. The fighting had spread across much of the countryside. Guerrilla movements had grown. Neighboring countries were involved. And more young men were being drawn into the conflict. For the people living through it, the years began to blur together. One year became another. Another season of planting. Another harvest. Another round of soldiers moving through the countryside. Another funeral. Another young man leaving home. The war had become part of ordinary life. And that was exactly what made guerrilla warfare so difficult to defeat. The Rhodesian security forces were powerful. They had professional soldiers, experienced police units, aircraft and specialized forces trained to operate in the bush. They developed ways of tracking guerrilla movements. They gathered information from the countryside. They launched patrols and ambushes. They also carried out operations across Rhodesia's borders against guerrilla bases and support networks. Some of these operations were highly successful from a military point of view. Guerrilla commanders and fighters were killed. Training camps were attacked. Weapons and supplies were destroyed. For a government trying to defeat an insurgency, these victories mattered. But they did not solve the larger problem. For every guerrilla group destroyed, others could emerge. The nationalist movement had access to neighboring countries. They could recruit new fighters. And, most importantly, the political grievance behind the war had not disappeared. The African majority still wanted majority rule. That meant Rhodesia faced a problem that military force alone could not easily solve. You can defeat a group of fighters. But how do you defeat an idea shared by millions of people? The nationalist movement understood this. Their strategy was not simply to destroy Rhodesian soldiers. It was to make the country increasingly difficult to govern. Roads became dangerous. Government officials became targets. Infrastructure could be attacked. Rural communities could be pressured. The government had to spend more resources protecting more places. And the longer this continued, the more expensive the war became. For white Rhodesian families, the conflict was becoming personal in another way. Young men were being called into military service. Some spent months away from home. Some spent years. A family might gather around the dinner table without knowing whether their son would return safely from his next operation. The country was also losing people who had once believed that Rhodesia's future was secure. Some white families began leaving. Others remained because they believed they had nowhere else to go. And some continued to believe strongly that the government was defending their homes from a communist-backed insurgency. There was no single white Rhodesian experience. Some supported the war passionately. Some were exhausted by it. Some opposed the government's policies. Others simply wanted their children to survive. Among black Rhodesians, the experience was equally varied. Some supported ZANU. Some supported ZAPU. Some worked with the government. Some joined the Rhodesian security forces. Some supported neither side. And many ordinary people simply tried to survive. This is important because wars rarely divide societies into two perfectly clean groups. People have fears. People have loyalties. People have families to protect. And sometimes people make choices because they believe they have no other choice. By this stage, the human cost was becoming enormous. Thousands of people had been killed during the conflict. Many more had been wounded, displaced, or traumatized. Families had been separated. Communities had been disrupted. And a generation of young Zimbabweans was growing up knowing war as part of normal life. But there was another pressure building. International isolation. Rhodesia had never gained broad international recognition after UDI. Britain continued to regard the declaration as illegal. The United Nations maintained sanctions. The country's international position remained difficult. And the war was consuming resources that Rhodesia increasingly struggled to replace. The government could still fight. But fighting forever was another matter. Meanwhile, the nationalist movements were becoming stronger. ZANLA was expanding its operations, particularly in rural areas. ZIPRO was also building its military capacity. The conflict was no longer a small rebellion on the edges of the country. It was becoming a national crisis. And the government faced an uncomfortable reality. Even if Rhodesian forces could continue winning individual battles, they were not producing a political settlement. Every military success had to be followed by another operation. Every operation required more soldiers, more money, more equipment, more families waiting at home. The war had become a machine that demanded more and more. And nobody could see where the machine would stop. Then another development made the situation even more difficult. Inside Rhodesia, attempts were made to create a political settlement that could satisfy both the white minority and the African majority. The most important of these efforts would become known as the internal settlement. It led to an election in 1979 and the creation of a government led by Ebo Muzorewa, who became Prime Minister. For a moment, it appeared that Rhodesia might have found a way out. But the major nationalist movements did not accept the arrangement as a genuine solution. The war continued. And that failure revealed something important. The conflict could not be ended simply by creating a new government inside Rhodesia. The major nationalist forces had to be brought into the settlement. Britain had to become involved. And the international community had to accept the result. By now, the country was exhausted. The guerrillas could not easily destroy the Rhodesian state. The Rhodesian forces could not destroy the nationalist movements. The politicians could not agree on a lasting solution. And ordinary people were paying the price. After years of fighting, the question had changed. It was no longer about proving which side was stronger. Both sides had already shown that they could continue fighting. The real question was whether they were prepared to stop. And slowly, reluctantly, the answer began to emerge. The guns had failed to settle the future of Rhodesia. Perhaps the negotiating table would have to try. Chapter 10. The Last Gamble. After years of fighting, Rhodesia had reached a point where victory was becoming difficult to imagine. The government could still send soldiers into the countryside. The nationalist movement could still send guerrillas across the borders. But neither side had found a way to force the other into complete surrender. The war had become too expensive, too bloody, and too deeply rooted. So Rhodesia tried another path. Politics. In 1978, Ian Smith's government reached an agreement with several moderate African politicians inside Rhodesia. The agreement became known as the Internal Settlement. Its purpose was to create a new political arrangement and move the country toward black majority participation in government. The leading African figure in the settlement was Bishop Abel Muzorewa. In 1979, elections were held. Muzorewa became Prime Minister. For Smith and his supporters, this was supposed to prove that Rhodesia could achieve a political solution without surrendering control to the armed nationalist movements. But the problem remained. The most powerful nationalist organizations were not part of the settlement. ZANU and ZAPU rejected it. They argued that the arrangement did not give the African majority genuine control of the country. The war continued. And Britain did not recognize the new government as the final answer either. So the internal settlement had failed to end the conflict. But something important had changed. The major players were beginning to understand that there was no easy military solution. The country needed a settlement that included the main nationalist movements. And that meant Britain had to return to the center of the negotiations. For years, Britain had insisted that Rhodesia's independence could not be separated from majority rule. Now Britain was preparing to help negotiate the transition. The talks would take place in London. The location was important. For years, the struggle had been fought in African villages, on roads, across borders, and in military camps. Now representatives of the opposing side would sit across from one another in a room. Men whose supporters had been killing each other were expected to negotiate. The conference began in September 1979 at Lancaster House. The main parties were represented. The British government was there. The government of Rhodesia was there. The nationalist movements were there. Among the most important figures were Robert Mugabe of ZANU and Joshua Nkomo of ZAPU. For the first time, the people who represented the major sides of the conflict were attempting to design a political future together. But peace was not going to come easily. There were arguments over elections, over land, over political power, over security, over the constitution. And there was a deep problem of trust. Each side had reasons to fear what might happen if it gave up its weapons. For the Rhodesian government and its supporters, there was fear of losing their political influence and their security. For the nationalist movements, there was fear that the old system might return under another name. For Britain, there was the challenge of finding an agreement that could produce a government with enough legitimacy to be accepted internationally. The negotiations lasted for months. Outside the conference room, the war continued. That contrast was striking. Inside, people were discussing clauses and constitutional arrangements. Outside, young men were still carrying rifles. Families were still waiting for loved ones. People were still dying. The negotiators knew that every disagreement could mean more fighting. Eventually, they reached an agreement. The Lancaster House Agreement created the framework for a transition to internationally recognized independence. There would be elections. There would be a new constitution. And Britain would oversee the transition. The parties agreed to a ceasefire. But a ceasefire is not the same as peace. Thousands of fighters had to lay down their weapons. Guerrillas had to come out of the countryside. Rhodesian forces had to return to their bases. People who had spent years fighting each other now had to live in the same country. And nobody knew exactly what would happen next. Then came the moment that had seemed almost impossible only a few years earlier. The guns began to fall silent. For people who had lived through the war, silence could feel strange. For years, there had been fear. Now there was uncertainty. Would the peace last? Would the election be fair? Would the losing side accept the result? Would the fighters return home? Would former enemies forgive one another? And most importantly, who would win? The answer would determine the future of the country. The election was held in February 1980. People went to the polls. For many, this was the first time they had been able to participate in a national political contest that could genuinely determine who would govern the country. The result was decisive. Robert Mugabe's ZANU won the largest share of the vote. Mugabe was invited to form a government. For some people, it was the fulfillment of years of struggle. For others, it was the beginning of a future they feared. But the result was accepted. The transition moved forward. And on April 18, 1980, the world witnessed something remarkable. The country that had once called itself Rhodesia became the independent nation of Zimbabwe. A new flag was raised. A new national identity was born. Robert Mugabe became the country's first prime minister. Prince Charles represented Britain at the independence ceremony. And among the crowds were people who had lived through the entire journey. Some had watched settlers arrive. Some had lost land. Some had fought in the nationalist armies. Some had served in the Rhodesian security forces. Some had lost husbands, wives, sons or daughters. And some had simply spent years trying to keep their families alive. Now they were standing in a new country. The war was over. But history was not finished. Because independence could change the government. It could change the flag. It could change the name on the map. But it could not erase what had happened before. The new country inherited the land question. It inherited racial tensions. It inherited economic inequality. It inherited soldiers from both sides. It inherited memories of violence. And it inherited a population that had spent years being taught to see one another as enemies. Zimbabwe had won independence. But now came the harder question. Could the people who had fought against one another learn to live together? That was the next test. And it would be faced not on a battlefield, but in the ordinary life of a new nation. Chapter 11. Zimbabwe. On April 18, 1980, something happened that would have seemed impossible 15 years earlier. The flag of Rhodesia came down. A new flag rose in its place. The country had a new name. Zimbabwe. For the people gathered in Salisbury that day, the moment carried different meanings. For some, it was the end of colonial rule. For others, it was the end of a war. For some white Rhodesians, it was the loss of a country they had always considered home. And for many Africans, it was the fulfillment of a struggle that had lasted for generations. The celebrations were enormous. People filled the streets. Music played. Crowds gathered. Families embraced. After years of uncertainty, there was finally a feeling that the future belonged to them. But independence was not simply a celebration. It was also a test. Zimbabwe was inheriting a country deeply divided by history. The new government had to govern people who had once been on opposite sides of a war. Former guerrillas had to return to civilian life. Former Rhodesian soldiers had to decide what their place would be in the new country. White farmers had to decide whether they would stay. Black Zimbabweans had to decide what independence would mean in their own lives. And Robert Mugabe had to turn a liberation movement into a government. He faced an enormous task. Zimbabwe had inherited a relatively developed economy. It had functioning railways. A strong agricultural sector. schools and hospitals, mining industries, cities with established infrastructure. But the benefits of that development had never been shared equally. The new government therefore faced a difficult balance. It wanted to expand education and healthcare. It wanted to improve opportunities for the black majority. But it also had to keep the economy working. Mugabe's government moved quickly in some areas. Education became a major priority. New schools were opened. More black Zimbabwean children gained access to education. Healthcare services expanded. For many families, independence brought changes they could see directly. A child who might once have had very limited educational opportunities could now dream of becoming a teacher, doctor, or professional. This was one of the early achievements of the new Zimbabwe. But the past had not disappeared. The country still had a complicated relationship with its land. Large commercial farms remained in white hands. For generations, land had been one of the deepest sources of inequality. The new government knew this. But changing land ownership was not simple. The Lancaster House settlement had included protections for property rights. And Britain had agreed to help finance land purchases for redistribution. For a time, the new government moved cautiously. Land reform would become one of Zimbabwe's biggest political questions in the decades that followed. But in 1980, nobody yet knew how that story would end. The more immediate challenge was reconciliation. Imagine fighting someone for years. You may have lost a friend to his side. He may have lost a brother to yours. Then suddenly the war ends. You are expected to live in the same country. Perhaps you pass him in the street. Perhaps your children attend the same school. What do you do with the memories? That question faced Zimbabweans across the country. Mugabe's government understood that the country could not survive if every former enemy remained an enemy. So the new government promoted reconciliation. Former Rhodesian soldiers were integrated into the new Zimbabwe National Army alongside former guerrilla fighters. Men who had once hunted each other in the bush now wore the same uniform. It was an extraordinary transformation. It did not erase the past. But it created the possibility of moving beyond it. The transition was not perfect. There were serious tensions within the new political order. ZANU and ZAPU remained separate political forces. Their supporters did not always trust each other. And in the early 1980s, political violence in Matabeleland would expose how fragile national unity remained. That history belongs to another chapter of Zimbabwe's story. But it reminds us of something important. Winning independence does not automatically create peace. A country can change its government and still carry the wounds of war. It can change its flag and still struggle with the inequalities inherited from the past. It can celebrate freedom while still asking what freedom should look like in everyday life. And that brings us back to the people who lived through the Rhodesian War. The farmer. The mother. The soldier. The guerrilla. The child who grew up hearing gunfire. For them, independence was not just a date in a history book. It was the possibility of waking up without expecting another war. It was the possibility of sending children to school without fear. It was the possibility of planning for next year instead of worrying about surviving the next week. But freedom also brought responsibility. The people who had fought for Zimbabwe now had to build Zimbabwe. And that was a much harder task than raising a flag. Because destroying an old political system is one thing. Building a country that works for everyone is another. The Rhodesian flag had come down. The guns had largely fallen silent. A new government was in power. And a new nation had entered the world. But beneath the celebrations were questions that would remain for generations. Who would own the land? How would former enemies live together? Could racial divisions truly disappear? Could political freedom become economic opportunity? And could the memories of war be turned into something other than hatred? Zimbabwe had won its independence. Now it had to decide what to do with it. The war had ended. The work of building the nation had begun. Chapter 12. What the war left behind. A war can end on paper before it ends in people's memories. In 1980, the fighting in Rhodesia came to an end. The country became Zimbabwe. The guerrillas returned from the bush. The soldiers returned to their families. The politicians began building a new government. But peace did not mean that everything had suddenly become whole again. Too many people had lost too much. There were graves across the countryside. There were mothers who had buried sons. Children had grown up without fathers. Some families had been forced from their homes. Others had watched their farms, villages, or communities become caught up in violence. And thousands of former fighters now had to learn how to live without a war. For years, their lives had been organized around one question. How do we defeat the enemy? Now the question was completely different. How do we live together? That was not easy. A former guerrilla could meet a former Rhodesian soldier in the street. They might recognize one another. They might remember a battle. They might remember a friend who never came home. But now there was only one country: Zimbabwe. The new government therefore faced the enormous task of bringing former enemies into a single national army. Former guerrillas from ZANU and ZAPU were incorporated alongside former Rhodesian forces. It was an unusual experiment. Men who had once been trained to kill one another were now expected to defend the same country. It did not erase suspicion overnight. But it showed that even after a bitter war, former enemies could be asked to build something together. There was another inheritance that was harder to solve: land. For decades, land had been at the heart of the conflict. European settlers had acquired large areas of productive farmland. African communities had lost access to much of that land. Independence changed the political system, but it could not instantly undo decades of unequal ownership. The new government therefore faced a difficult choice. How could it redistribute land without destroying the agricultural economy? How could it correct a historical injustice while respecting property rights? How could it satisfy millions of land-hungry people without creating another crisis? At first, land reform moved relatively slowly. Britain provided financial support for land purchases under the agreement surrounding independence. But over the years, frustration grew. For many black Zimbabweans, independence had promised more than a new flag. They expected the land question to be addressed. And when that did not happen quickly enough, disappointment grew. Eventually, land became one of the most explosive political issues in Zimbabwe. But there was another legacy of the war that could not be measured in acres: memory. People remembered the war differently. One person remembered liberation. Another remembered fear. One remembered a brother who joined the guerrillas. Another remembered a father who served in the Rhodesian forces. One person remembered British colonialism. Another remembered the country of Rhodesia as the only home they had ever known. These memories could exist in the same country. Sometimes, they could even exist inside the same family. That is what makes history difficult. There is rarely one memory. There are many. And sometimes they contradict one another. The Rhodesian Bush War was therefore not simply a story about soldiers and guerrillas. It was a story about ordinary people caught inside a political struggle much larger than themselves. People who wanted to farm. People who wanted to raise children. People who wanted to study. People who wanted to live without fear. And people who believed deeply enough in their political cause that they were willing to risk their lives for it. The war also left a complicated military legacy. The Rhodesian security forces had developed highly specialized counterinsurgency methods. Some of their units became famous for their ability to operate in difficult terrain. The nationalist armies, meanwhile, had learned how to survive against a stronger military by using mobility, local knowledge, and political organization. Both sides adapted. Both sides suffered losses. And both sides carried their experiences into the new Zimbabwe. But perhaps the most important lesson is not about military strategy. It is about what happens when political power becomes concentrated in the hands of one group for too long. For decades, white Rhodesians feared losing control. African nationalists demanded that control be transferred to the majority. Neither side could find a lasting solution through politics. Eventually, The dispute became a war. And the war lasted for years. Thousands died before the country finally returned to the negotiating table. That does not mean that every person on either side was driven by hatred. History is rarely that simple. Some people were defending a political system. Some were fighting against it. Some were fighting because they believed in freedom. Some were fighting because they feared what would happen if they did not. And many civilians simply wanted the fighting to stop. In the end, no battlefield victory settled the question. The solution came through negotiation, elections, and the creation of a new political order. That may be one of the most important things to remember about the Rhodesian Bush War. The war did not end because one side completely destroyed the other. It ended because the people involved eventually had to accept that the country could not remain as it was. Rhodesia could not remain a permanently isolated white ruled state. The nationalist movement could not simply take the country by force. Britain could not ignore the crisis forever. And the people of the country could not continue paying the price indefinitely. So the guns went quiet. And Zimbabwe was born. But more than 40 years later, the questions left behind by that war have not completely disappeared. Questions about land. Questions about race. Questions about political power. Questions about memory. Questions about what independence should mean. These are not only Zimbabwean questions. They are questions that appear again and again in the history of countries emerging from colonial rule. Because gaining a flag is one thing. Building a country where people feel that the country belongs to them is another. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of Rhodesia. It reminds us that when a society gives one group political power and another group the feeling that it has no future, the tension does not simply disappear. It waits. It grows. And eventually, somebody has to decide how to resolve it. For Rhodesia, that resolution came through years of war. For Zimbabwe, the challenge was what came afterward. A country had been born. Now its people had to decide what kind of country it would become. Epilogue. The country that had to be born twice. The story of Rhodesia does not end with the lowering of one flag. It ends with a question. What makes a country truly free? Is it the color of the flag? The name on the map? The person sitting in the Prime Minister's office? Or is freedom something deeper? For decades, this land was called Rhodesia. It was home to millions of Africans whose families had lived there long before the name existed. It also became home to generations of white settlers who were born there, raised families there and eventually came to think of the country as their own. Between these two histories grew a political system built on unequal power. The white minority controlled the government. The African majority demanded a voice. And when politics failed to settle the argument, young men took up guns. The Rhodesian Bush War followed. For years, the countryside became a place of ambushes, patrols, fear and loss. There were guerrillas. There were soldiers. There were police officers. There were families caught between them. And there were thousands of people whose names history may never remember. They were farmers, mothers, fathers, teachers, students, children. Ordinary people who simply happened to be living where history decided to become violent. Then, in 1980, the war ended. Rhodesia disappeared. Zimbabwe was born. For many Africans, this was the fulfillment of a dream. The dream of majority rule. The dream of political independence. The dream that a child born in Africa would no longer have to live under a government controlled by a racial minority. But independence did not erase history. It did not return every piece of land. It did not bring back every person who had died. It did not remove every racial wound. It did not make former enemies forget what they had seen. And it certainly did not guarantee that the new country would always make the right choices. That is why the story of Rhodesia should not be told as a simple story of heroes and villains. History is more complicated than that. Ian Smith was not a British governor sent to Rhodesia to rule on Britain's behalf. He was a white Rhodesian politician who believed that his country should become independent. But he wanted that independence without accepting immediate African majority rule. The African nationalist movements, meanwhile, were fighting for political power and an end to minority rule. Their struggle produced leaders, fighters, and martyrs. But it also produced violence, divisions, and suffering. And ordinary Zimbabweans often paid the highest price. That is the tragedy of the story. The people who had the least power often had the most to lose. When governments argued, they waited. When armies fought, they hid. When borders closed, they suffered. When young men left to fight, mothers waited for them to return. And when the war finally ended, everyone had to live with what remained. Today, Zimbabwe is a different country. But the questions left behind by Rhodesia have not completely disappeared. Who should own the land? How should a country repair the damage caused by colonialism? How should former enemies live together? How do you build a national identity after years of racial division? And perhaps the hardest question of all. How do you make independence mean something in the daily lives of ordinary people? Those questions cannot be answered by changing a flag alone. They cannot be answered by winning a war alone. They cannot even be answered by winning an election alone. They require something harder. They require a country to decide what it wants to become. The story of Rhodesia is therefore not only a story about white settlers, African nationalists, Ian Smith, Robert Mugabe, or the soldiers who fought in the bush. It is a story about power. It is a story about land. It is a story about belonging. And above all, it is a story about what happens when people who share the same land cannot agree on who the country belongs to. In 1980, Zimbabwe was born. But perhaps a country like that has to be born twice. First, when the old political order disappears. And again, when its people finally build a society in which the country feels like home to everyone. That second birth is always harder. And it never truly ends. Because history does not disappear when the guns fall silent. It stays in the land. It stays in the graves. It stays in family stories. It stays in the memories of people who were there. And it stays in the questions that each new generation asks. What happened here? Why did it happen? And perhaps most importantly, what can we learn from it? This was the story of Rhodesia. A country caught between two visions of freedom. A country that went to war over who would control its future. And a country that eventually had to discover that no society can live forever by denying the future to the majority of its people. Rhodesia ended. Zimbabwe began. But the story of the people who lived through it remains.